Hey everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to give you guys a quick update on my experience with the Sony HX300. This is Sony's latest addition to the CyberShot family of point-and-shoot cameras. It is a mega zoom compact camera, and even though I say it's compact, it clearly is not a pocketable point-and-shoot, but it is compact in the sense that when comparing it to what you'd have to carry in order to afford the focal range and flexibility, all of the bells and whistles that this camera embodies, then yes, it is really a compact model. Now, it is larger than its predecessor, the HX200V, and it does lose some of the features that were part of the HX100 and 200V in terms of its lineage, but in that same step, it also gains quite a bit in terms of focal range, as well as some other things that I'm going to go over as I give you guys this update. So in terms of price point, we're looking at the same $499.99 that the HX100 and 200V both originally retailed for. I want to tell you guys first that you do lose GPS on this model. You also lose the electronic viewfinder sensor, unfortunately, something that's been incorporated into both of those previous generations of this camera. But thankfully, even with those losses, Sony really does make up for quite a bit of that. First, I want to point out the new 50X Zeiss glass. And in my testing thus far, autofocus on this camera is definitely slightly faster than what you'll get from the 200V. And of course, that applies to the 100V as well. They've also taken design into account here. Quite frankly, the 100 and 200V followed the exact same design cues. We do have a larger body here, and as a result, Sony has taken advantage of that in some regards, and I'd say that because handling is certainly better, and when you're using a bridge camera, you do want handling that's similar to a digital SLR experience. I think that's what most of us set out to get, as long as it's light enough. And the good news is that even though this body is considerably larger than the 200V, the weight is not significantly more. So that is certainly a benefit. This is going to handle more like a digital SLR, and the 50X lens certainly is a welcomed addition. Now, it does put Sony in a club that's relatively narrow. Only a few other manufacturers have 50X bragging rights, and whether or not this really stands up to its chief competition, which is Canon's 50X mega zoom, is really going to be a matter of, I think, user performance rather than automatic performance. I can tell you guys right now, in my experience with this camera, if you're going to sit on either of the automatic modes, you're going to get better performance on the previous generation of CyberShot mega zoom cameras, the 100 or 200V. And I know that may sound odd, but a lot of that has to do with this brand new lens, and also I think part of it may be the new stabilization system, but I'm not going to really speculate on that. The point is, this camera does perform significantly differently than previous generations, which we often cannot say for incremental upgrades of this sort. So this is far from incremental, in my opinion. I've mentioned some of the drawbacks, like the loss of the sensor, which you can find on many cameras that Sony manufactures, really since the acquisition of Konica Minolta. That's when they incorporated that. Also, you've gained now a manual button for employing the flash, something that was not existent on previous models. Another cue that kind of points towards a more manual experience, the fact that you now have a filter thread, also something missing from the previous 100 and 200V. Another sign that Sony is acknowledging that the user out there that's picking this up really maybe isn't a traditional point-and-shoot user. Even though they knew that already, they didn't quite expect that they'd want as many manual features. So while the 200V has a built-in neutral density filter, which is a really nice touch for a camera where you can't attach anything, at least that is a Sony accessory because there is no thread, here you can attach pretty much anything you want. So if manual and more of a hands-on approach are what you're looking for in a camera like this rather than a simple point-and-shoot experience, Sony has taken that into account and done quite a good job. As far as the actual zoom ring, far more responsive than what you'll get out of the 200V. So that's also a really big improvement. It's not monumental, but it's almost real time. So compared to the 200V, if you haven't used it, that is significant. The motor is still going to be recorded when you're zooming, shooting video, but that's one of the great things about this camera. While Sony may not best Canon at the 50X end of this lens, despite the fact that the Zeiss glass is really good, they are going to outdo Canon in every video aspect. And putting this in the right user's hand is all the difference. And I say that because this is the first member of the Mega Zoom lineup from the CyberShot family that really does allow for much more manual control, or really does benefit from it, is what I should say, far more than previous generations. And even though that should apply to every camera you purchase in this day and age, or even in the past, obviously, the point is that Sony has recognized a need for improvements. Another benefit besides the thread there for filters and whatever else you might want to attach, the other good thing is that the lens cap no longer attaches to the frame of the actual barrel of the lens, as opposed to, like every other camera on Earth, attaching to the lens itself. So no more tethering of the actual lens cap. You now have the benefit of that if you accidentally or power the camera with the lens cap on, it's not going to shoot off and be dependent on that tether that was included with previous generations, which wasn't really a design flaw in my opinion, but it was a different approach than what this camera represents. And that's what I've been getting at if I haven't been clear, but hopefully I have been. So what else do we see out of this? Of course, we do have a sensor with a higher megapixel rating, but in my use day-to-day so far, that really hasn't been a deciding factor at all. Image quality seems exactly the same. As I mentioned, handling a little bit better here because I actually like the fact that we're getting up to the size of a digital SLR, at least entry-level one, and that's critical. Battery life, I didn't talk to you guys about. I want to talk briefly about that because there is a significant loss there. That's another step backwards, unfortunately, for this camera. The battery that we're seeing here used is the same battery that's found in the RX100 as well as the RX1, and it's a fine battery. There's nothing wrong with it. I showed you guys in the unboxing how quite frankly ridiculous this looks because we've got a camera here that got larger than the previous generation, but the battery is just about, I would say, a third in size. I'm not going on rating there, but a third in size is what I will say. And you guys can tell it's as if the entire compartment has been filled. So I can't say whether or not this is a result of the fact that Sony ran out of room, although it certainly doesn't look like it, or it's just a shift in the entire brand. You know, it's a lot more efficient to have one battery that's going to accommodate a variety of your best-selling cameras. So right now, this is in this brand new latest addition to the CyberShot family. It's in the flagship RX100 and RX1. So from a conception, of what you'd want to have in your bag from that perspective, of being able to carry one battery that could work across all of your cameras, I certainly like that idea. But above and beyond that, no real benefit because you are losing quite a bit of battery life with that. On the 100 and 200V, you were looking at over 400 shots. Here you're looking at a little over 300. So that is a real loss. I can't dress that up and tell you guys that, well, the battery does this better, because it doesn't. It's really just a matter of if you do have other Sony cameras, that'll be the only benefit. Of course, no charger comes with this camera, meaning outside of the camera, you will have to charge it on body. You do have the benefit of being able to charge it, though, using a USB cable. So in the event that you do forget your wall charger, any micro USB will pretty much charge this camera. So that's definitely a good thing. But that was also present in last year's HX300V, and that camera had the benefit of also coming with a dedicated charging port, something this camera doesn't have. Other things to point out. The GPS is something that I really would have liked to have seen kept on board. I think that's more of a cost-cutting measure. I know I mentioned it earlier, but really this camera takes just about every feature that the 200V has and pushes it just a bit beyond what you may expect. And I think that's part of why so many of us wonder whether or not this camera is going to succeed. But I can tell you guys right now, in the experience I've had, everything has been pretty much as expected, which is impressive because I really wasn't sure if the 50x lens would be able to work at, the longest end. And so far, it's definitely performed relatively well, as long as you stay out of the automatic settings. So I keep pointing that out because for people who do tend to stay in the auto settings, they're actually going to think this camera is inferior to the 100 or 200V. That's at least in my experience. If you have experience otherwise, please, mention it in the comments. Anything constructive is always good for everybody in the community who's interested in this camera. In terms of gains, I mentioned autofocus is, definitely improved. Is it twice as fast as Sony points out? I'm not sure that we're really getting twice the speed, but there's definitely an improvement. White balance, I've also noticed, definitely improved here. You also have better image stabilization. I can't argue against that. There's no question the image stabilization is superior. There may be some trade-offs. I can't tell you guys exactly what they are yet in terms of performance, but overall image stabilization is superior. Also, I want to point out that there are some bugs. It's not a bug-free experience. I have noticed, as many of you may also, if you take a look at the zoom sample I put up, which I'll incorporate into the description of this video, that at the longest end of this zoom, when I pull it back, and it seems to happen pretty consistently, it's almost as if the lens barrel shifts from the right to the left, and it actually moves whatever you're recording. So while the video quality is great, that's not something that existed in previous generations of this camera. And that concerns me because that's one of those bugs where I say that may be part of the new image stabilization. The fact that it's on the front end now, maybe the transition is not perfect if you're doing it quickly. Haven't quite figured it out yet, but it's something I've noticed. If you guys take a look at that video, as I mentioned, there will be a link in the description. You'll probably notice what I'm talking about. It's not a major problem, but this is one of those things where I'm not sure if this has got, some lemon-esque features going, or this is just part of the new standard in terms of the rebuild. So overall, I am really liking this camera. There's no question that there have been some steps backwards. But overall, you're still getting an experience that is unmatched in the point-and-shoot segment, in my opinion. And as I mentioned before, when comparing it to something like Canon's 50X offering, you're going to get a much better video experience out of this camera. On the still side of things, as I mentioned earlier, if it's put in the right hands, then I think it can just about perform right up there with the Canon. But there's no question on video, it will blow Canon out of the water. One other thing I forgot to mention, the electronic viewfinder in this camera, another step backwards. Unfortunately, you do lose review capability in the EVF. So if that's important to you, that was a feature on the 100 and 200V. That's another thing absent from this camera. But overall, that's just what I can give you guys in terms of initial impressions, things that I know are vacant from this camera that were present in both the 100 and 200V, since they're all identical in price, and these are, all the generations of this model. Clearly, it's relevant to point out, but right now, if you're on the fence, I can say if you pick up this camera, you will not be disappointed. I've pointed out just about everything you guys need to know, at least at face value, for this $500 retail Mega Zoom. It has performed beyond my expectations, and right now I have really nothing negative overall to say outside of what I've told you guys, which many would consider nitpicking. So if you're in the market for a Mega Zoom, I can tell you right now, you won't be disappointed with this camera, especially if you need an electronic viewfinder, which I think most people who are looking for a body style like this obviously want one. It is identical to the electronic viewfinder in the 200 and 100V, at least in my testing. And by actual resolution specifications. The microphone array is a little bit smaller than the one on the 100 and 200V, but performance is pretty much the same. So I think I've covered just about everything. It really comes down to whether or not you guys want to wait for my full review, but I know a lot of people are impatient and really want this camera now, and I don't blame them, because this is the first member of the Mega Zoom lineup from Sony to actually take the most important step, which is an increase in optical range. And by the way, I will just power the camera on so you guys can see how far it actually extends. For those of you curious, out of body, that's exactly where you're going to hit 1200 millimeters. So not really too I would say abrasive considering the reach. It's actually quite compact. I will give you guys a side-by-side, don't worry, with the HX300V while I have both cameras in my possession, so that those of you who are willing to wait will get as thorough a rundown as I can possibly deliver. But right now, as I've mentioned, really liking this camera. There isn't a lot to criticize. I think I've given you guys a pretty full picture. Even though this isn't my full review, for many of you, this probably is more than enough. But to follow. I'll go through menus, settings, just about everything you'll want to know about this brand new mega zoom camera. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.